Hello there, sword friends. This is going to be a review of a TomKin Messer. As is tradition, I will note some of my biases, and the first thing that is probably most important to note is that I kind of know Tom. Now, I wouldn't say we're brothers from another mother type situation or we're really close friends, but I do consider him a friend, and I've known him for years over various sword groups and forums and things like that, and we've had a few conversations about various things, so yeah, that's something I suppose you should know. Now, I think I can still be objective, but I suppose you can be the judge of that. The second thing is that I got the sword secondhand, and so by secondhand, that means it may not be representative of what you would get from Tom directly. Now, I think it is. It doesn't seem like it was used by any of the previous owners, but nevertheless, know that I did purchase it secondhand. The third thing you should know is that I am not a student of historic European martial arts, and I mentioned this a few different times, but I make no claim to know really how to effectively use this sword, so as I describe its dynamic properties or how I think it feels, know that that's through the lens of somebody that doesn't really understand the historic context or the martial context in terms of the art that this would be used in. Now, I do study some Filipino martial arts and I study some Japanese martial arts, and, you know, this isn't unfamiliar in terms of how it feels, but I'll admit I'm certainly no expert with it. The last bit of rambling nonsense I suppose I should note is that I did purchase it with my own money, and Tom isn't asking me to do this review, but it does sound like he might participate in it. So my plan for this review is something a little different. One, not only have I not reviewed a Messer, so I have some things to explore there, but two, I haven't really reviewed or interviewed a craftsman while he's watched the review beforehand. So if you can follow the logic of this review, my plan is to make this video, send it to Tom, give him a chance to respond to whatever praises or criticisms I have in an interview, along with him discussing how he made the sword, project, you know, this, that, or the other, the cool things that come with knowing actually how to make the stuff. And that should give him a chance to address any kind of concerns that I have, and I think that's probably the most useful and applicable. Normally, I would do an interview if I had the opportunity to, and then just put out a review, but it doesn't seem like that would be the most effective. If I have some critique, especially knowing that I'm admittedly a novice in the realm of Messers, it would be best to have the craftsman be able to have a chance to address them. So that's the plan for this review. It's something a little different. I'm also trying to edit in a new type of software, so there's all sorts of firsts as it relates to me doing stuff here. All right, anyway, on with the show. Now, normally when I do a sword review, I start with a pommel, and I'm going to in this review as well, but the first thing I think I need to address is something that I'm going to probably say a lot. And I've spent some time fucking around with this Messer, looking at it, measuring it, all of that type of thing. And really, the thing that I need to call out is that there are a lot of little things on here, that a lot of little imperfections that aren't imperfections from a functional standpoint, but are imperfections from a cosmetic standpoint. Now, I'm going to call them all out, and I just want to note, I don't exactly know what Tom's goal was when he made this sword, if he was going for perfection or not, but generally from the conversations I've had with him, he seems to be a guy that's trying to deliver a really great performing sword dynamically. It should feel good in your hand, it should move, it should cut, it should do what a sword can do, and then the aesthetics are a secondary thing. Now, I don't think he's trying not to make it look good, but at the same time, there's a lot of things that I notice in here that are just little blemishes, little imperfections, little things that with some more time or a little more care could have been made quite a bit better. And I thought I would address that right away because I'm going to be really nitpicky, and, you know, maybe it's just and maybe it's not, but there are going to be things that I note on here that are all along the same vein, and that is just little imperfections from an aesthetic standpoint, but you know, nothing really stands out as a imperfection as it relates to performance. So I'll call it out right away because I'm gonna go and, you know, bitchy. I'm gonna be bitchy. So here we go, the pommel. The first thing that stands out to me in the pommel is this copper inlay. And what you can see is Tom has inlaid this copper symbol on both sides of the pommel. The thing that I notice, again, as I noted my little bitchiness, is that the inlay has gaps. Along with that, they're not symmetrical, and the lines kind of wander a little bit. It's not crisp. Now, a lot of times if I'm looking at metal work or decorative metal inlay on other swords, if I go to medieval European stuff, the idea of symmetry isn't necessarily the same, but this isn't necessarily along that same line. It looks, well, it looks like his first shot at doing it. Well, not quite the first shot. That's maybe a little too crass, but it wanders a little bit, and they're not as clean, crisp, and precise as they could be. I can get my hand kind of in some of the little grooves here where the inlay, where there's a gap in the copper, and some of the lines just kind of move around a little bit more than I think they should. If it was a little crisper, a little cleaner, a little more well done, I think it would be a nice adornment. As it is, I think it almost detracts a little bit from the overall look. I like it. I like that it's there, but the kind of I don't know, the imperfectness of it isn't really a positive thing to me. Now, sometimes people like the imperfect look. It gives it a sense of handmade ruggedness. This doesn't do that for me personally. The rest of the pommel, though, I really, really like. Now, there's an Elmslie typology system, and I'm sure this has a typology portion to it, or a style, or a number, or a classification, and I don't really know what that is. But what I will tell you is that from a functional standpoint, from a one-handed piece, the grip feels pretty good, but if I move my grip more towards the pommel, this little hook shape lets me almost use a pistol grip, and if I want to cast the sword in a different way, it really helps keep my hand in there. I'm familiar with that from the Filipino style weapons that I've used, and this little shape here is very functional. It also, if I wanted to use two hands on here for some reason, I can choke up on the grip and I can get another couple fingers in here, and I can almost use this blade two-handed. Not that it would necessarily be something you'd want to do, but this is actually a very, very comfortable. Nothing on here as I move my hand around without a glove on bites into my skin or choke. There's no rough edges that prevent me from really using it to its fullest effect, but it does look a little rough around the edges, especially right here in that inlay. The rest of it, as you can see, there are some kind of tapered edges along here, and it has kind of some gentle profiling. It looks like Tom spent a lot of time shaping this to make it kind of fit and look the way it does, and it, from a functional standpoint, is extremely comfortable. The other thing that I'll note on here on the pommel is that the peen block and the peg in the pommel are reasonably well done, but again, there's just some things that I don't think are great, in the sense that, one, some of the pegs I can, it looks like it's trying to hide in there, and then in other ways it wants to be seen as present, and I'm not quite sure I really like how that came out. It would have been nice if you either tried to blend them in so I didn't know it was there, or leave it as maybe if you used copper or something like that, it would stand out as a different material. But the mix between blending into the steel and showing up throws it off a little bit for me. Again, these are personal or aesthetic things. I don't know that it really has any impact on performance. The peen has both a peen block in it and a peg. It's very secure and well mounted to the tang of the blade, or basically it's constructed like overbuilt, super strong, not going to fall apart. Now, the pommel has this copper inlay in it, but it also is made of mild steel, and what you might be able to notice, if you can even see here, is that my fingerprints are starting to show up, and even some dry handling of this stuff could leave some rust, so it's important to oil it up when I'm done with it, because it looks like it's rusting just from leaving it out over a day or two. Moving on to the grip. Now, the grip has 3 pegs in it, and it's made from 5,000-year-old bogwood. At least that's what Tom says it is. Now, I have no idea how to tell how old the bogwood is or isn't, but it certainly has a nice look. It's finished well, at least in my hand without a glove in it. It's very comfortable. If my hands are wet or something like that, it doesn't seem to stain or lose grip. So from the standpoint of wood choice, I like the dark look aesthetic, but I have no idea how to tell if it's 5,000 years old or not, or just a piece of oak that's stained. It's very hard. It's very I can't really dig my fingernail into it or anything like that. So from an aesthetic choice, I really like the wood, but the aesthetic choice there is also gonna leave a little. There's some aesthetic issues. I'm going to be bitchy again. So one, the scales right down here, I can kind of dig my fingernail in and start pulling away at some of the glue or epoxy that's used underneath the scales. Along the spine of the blade here, where the tang is exposed, you can also see it almost looks like weld marks or something like that, or pieces where it's not quite attached. I'm not sure, but there's basically just imperfections here, and I would like it to be smooth. Also, I'm able to, on the pegs, I'm able to kind of get my fingernail over some of them. There is like a ledge, a transition, so as Tom is grinding it, the wood is marginally lower than the peg. I can feel the peg stand out a little bit larger than the wood itself, but it's really just, that isn't necessarily so bad, because as I grip it, none of the pegs are standing out so much that they bite into my hands, and that's really where they would irritate me. I notice them just a little bit, like it's almost less than a millimeter that they rise over the wood, but I do notice it as I run my hand over it. The transitions just aren't as perfect as they could be. The rest of it is this little imperfection. The scales don't line up kind of perfectly well. I can see the glue. I can see kind of different little bits in the metal that look unfinished or not perfectly smooth. And that is the same as it transitions up into the crossguard. There's just bits that look kind of hard hand filed or welded on that have less aesthetic appeal. None of it, I want to point out, bite into my hand. From a functional perspective, there's nothing that irritates me in terms of moving it around or holding it in my hand. But as I look at it, it just looks like a little more time, a little more care, a little more file work. I don't know, a little more whatever zazz it takes to make these things would have been able to remove some of those imperfections, or at least dress them up in a way that made it look like an additional detail. Shape-wise on the handle, it has a nice kind of swell to it, and it has a Messer knife handle on it. It's a very comfortable handle, I will say that much. Now, in talking about the crossguard, there's quite a lot to say. Now, I've addressed some of the imperfections that where the handle kind of meet the crossguard, but Tom went really kind of all in when it came to the shape. There's a lot of angles on this thing, and for a mild steel handmade kind of crossguard, there's a lot to be done here in terms of the kind of gentle tapers on both sides. You've got a square that needs to, a square kind of peg here. So he's got sides and kind of bevels and angles. There's this little swell in here where, it allows you to thumb the blade a little bit. He's got a nail, or the kind of knuckle guard, if you will, over here. And I mean, there's a lot of geometry taking place on this handguard, and I admire him for taking on this kind of challenge. But again, here, as I'm doing my little bitchy thing, there's things to note. So one, the handguard isn't perfectly straight. Some of the squares are off center. It's also not perfectly even in terms of where the taper is, or the swells are. And then if I look at this little knuckle guard, one side is marginally thicker than the other. I can make out some of the grinding marks, and where this is welded on, it almost looks like I can make out the spots where it's welded. I think is what I'm looking at here. It looks like it's welded and then kind of sanded down, but it lacks a little bit of refinement. I can make out a lot of the marks of manufacture. Now, from a functional standpoint, everything is really sturdy. I can hammer on it. It's not moving around. It does what it's supposed to be doing. It also has a lot of detail in it. It's really a very functional thing, and it feels comfortable. So from that side of things, it's not bad. And I like that he put this little groove in here to, if you want to use your thumb on the blade, it's a possible thing. From a user perspective, a lot of thought went into how it should feel, and I think he really hit the mark there. But from how it looks, there's just a lot of non-symmetrical little things that anyone with OCD is maybe going to go a little bit crazy. Another thing to note about the crossguard is the opening where the blade comes in. And what I'm basically noticing is that it's just not terribly even. It's a little rough around the edges. I can make out some of the glue and bits underneath the guard. And yeah, the opening is just a little wider. Maybe it would let water get in there. I'm not exactly sure. I don't have a problem with water getting in there myself. But it is larger than perhaps it needs to be. I understand that it's probably really, really difficult to get those to be, almost friction fit, closed shut, but nevertheless, I think when you're looking at a custom sword, that's something that you'd like to have, and it's just not here. Function wise, I don't think it really makes a huge difference. It's a nice to have, it's not a need to have, but it is something to note. The other thing is where the crossguard meets the edge here, you can see that it kind of cuts in a little bit. Now, I'm not exactly sure why this kind of tapers in ever so slightly. I don't know if it's not really comfortable to put my finger up here, and I have big meaty sausage hands. I'm not sure why it cuts in here, but I think that I don't know, it doesn't seem like it should. So those are the oddnesses that I notice with the crossguard. Now we can talk about the pointy stabby part, and this blade is classified as an Elmslie type 3E0, and I don't know admittedly a lot about the Elmslie typology system. I know Shad made a video about it some time ago, and there's really a lot to it, or maybe not a lot to it. I don't frankly know. What I can say is that when I look at the picture, it does look like the 3E picture. The 0 usually indicates kind of a straight blade, and this one has a slight forward recurve, but it doesn't curve backwards, so I don't know if I kind of question the 0 part, but smarter people than me classified it. So anyways, it's a 3E0 blade from the Elmslie typology system, and it's also made out of 80CRV version 2, or 80CRV2. 80CR version. I don't know exactly what that is, but 80CRV2 is the steel that Tom says he used, hand forged, and that it's hardened to a 56 or 57 HRC. I don't have the files or the mechanisms to really test if that is the case or not, but I will trust Tom's knowledge of metallurgy to say that it is or isn't, you know, that hard. What I can say about the blade is that there's some kind of goofiness. There's a lot of geometry really happening here, and a lot to appreciate. One, it starts off with this kind of wide, fat base, and note that the guard, or well, rather the blade, isn't centered on the grip. Now that's not necessarily abnormal for Messers. I don't know if it would be weird if a Messer had a handle that was centered or off-center. But anyway, as I was looking at it being off-center, it made me think of what is this doing? And one thing, or maybe a byproduct, is that my fingers are kind of right in line with the tip of the blade here. Maybe that was intentional by Tom. I like to think that it was, but the result, or maybe not the result, but a contributing factor, is that I feel very connected to the tip of the blade. It feels very, very agile, very active, and I don't know if that's in relation to the position or not, but anyway, we'll talk about that more later. The other bit is that it has a wide, fat base here that gradually begins tapering down. There's a taper to the blade as it comes up here, and there's also a distal taper where the blade thins out slightly. The reverse side is, or the back side of the blade is sharp, and the back side of this blade is sharper than the strong of most European blades that I have. Tom made a large secondary bevel. I don't know that it's necessarily really that large. There is a secondary bevel, and it's very pronounced because of how shiny it is, but it's not really any greater or worse than most secondary bevels you'd see. It's just that Tom stands out because it has, I think the way he strops it or something, it gives it, you know, I call it a Tomone almost, because it's Tom's version of a hamon on a blade. It is this nice kind of shiny thing, and it gives it a, I don't know, a kind of a unique look. The blade has also got some degree of polish on it. Now, it's not quite a mirror polish, but it's higher grit than most of the polishes that I see on European style swords. And what that means is that imperfections start to show quite a bit more. So as it's secondhand, I don't know how much of the scratching or scuffing or things like that was on the blade when Tom sent it out. But you know, if you take a Scotch pad and run it the wrong way across the blade, you'll begin to see those little marks in the polish, because it has a not quite mirror polish, but it's a bit shinier than the, you know, 400 grit or 600 grit that you would normally see. The other thing I can note on the blade is, again, you have this maker's mark here inlaid in copper, and the lines on this part are quite a bit straighter, but what I do notice is that there are some little bits here which I can almost feel with my fingernail where the copper isn't set into the steel. Now, I don't know if that's going to rust over time or how bad that's going to be, but it is an imperfection that I'd say I noticed. The inlay is cool, but there's bits of it that aren't fully inlaid. Now, the other thing that I'll note is that the blade is really sharp. Tom got it really sharp, and the lines on here are not, you know, perfect. I can see, maybe you're able to see this, there's a little bit of wibbly wobbly in terms of the planes of the blade, though from a European sword standpoint, that is not crazy. Most of the European swords that I see don't put the same emphasis on a glass, plain, smooth blade. Some do, but, you know, I wouldn't say that this is something I would hold against the blade. And in fact, it's, you know, for a forged blade, you know, pretty clean and even. What I do make out, though, other than the kind of wobbles on the flat of the surface, is that there's a recurve in the blade. Now, I didn't notice this the first time, and it's really hard for me to show you because when I zoom out on the blade or show you in a camera, it's you can't see it the same way I do. This line on the blade kind of wiggles around on the edge here, and it's more than just a recurve. So as I look the blade, you know, it wiggles around a little, then it's curving in this way, then it swoops back out to about here, and then it kind of wiggles around, but the edge isn't flat. It kind of meanders just a little bit. It's not substantial. It's not a huge thing, but it wiggles around a lot, and I don't know why that is. That seems, the recurve I kind of understand, but generally speaking, there's, you know, it's flat and consistent, and it doesn't kind of shake around on the edge so much. Now it's not horrible. You know, I really have to look at the blade to examine it, and it's something that doesn't come out super well on camera here, so it must not be that big a deal, or you would be able to see it quite a bit better. I'm trying to get this thing to participate, and maybe you can see what I'm talking about here. Yay, camera participating, high f-stop. Okay, well anyway, I did my best to try and show some of the various ways that it moves around and also has a recurve. The recurve is actually kind of cool. Tom did say he was going for that, where it comes in and then comes back out. But the wobbliness on the edge is, I don't know, so something that drives me a little bit nuts. The planes being uneven are not so crazy. And honestly, on the spine of the blade, if I look at the edge here, it also kind of swells and moves around a little bit, you know, but is actually a little straighter than this one. This one seems, it's not the recurve that throws me off, it's just that it kind of shakes a little bit. And, you know, if you're talking about a custom sword, you know, little imperfections here where it's shaky or imperfect is one thing, but the edge not being straight or not having like a nice smooth plane is something that I haven't noticed in a lot of swords before. I haven't seen that happen, other than, you know, some certain obvious, you know, bad examples, but I haven't seen that in a custom sword before. And maybe it's intentional. Maybe there's a reason for that. I don't know. We'll ask Tom later. But anyway, that is the thing that throws me off a little bit. The recurve though is pretty cool. And one thing that I will say in terms of handling. So I'm going to put up the Sword Dynamics computer stuff, and I'll show you that first. Now, as I examine the Weapon Dynamics computer, one thing that I'm going to note is that the two nodes that I measured here on the grip, one is really close to the node, and the other is kind of right where the pommel starts, and they're very close together. Now, I haven't personally measured the Weapon Dynamics computer on a lot of one-handed swords, so I can't say how accurate that is. But one thing that I did notice is that a lot of times as I enter measurements into the Weapon Dynamics computer, I am off from what this kind of predicted or the theoretical value is. A lot of times there's a greater variance. Sometimes I'm within the bubble, sometimes I'm not, and I don't know what to make of that. But this pretty much, you know, was dead balls on. Maybe I'm getting better at measuring the stuff, but I thought it was interesting that it came out so accurate, you know, compared to the theoretical. So that's an interesting thing for me. And hopefully this diagram gives you some indication of, when I say it feels lively, why it feels that way. So I just shared with you some of the information about the Weapon Dynamics computer in terms of how it dynamically feels. So hopefully the mathematical side of things is a better representative than, you know, my novice level of knowledge. But what I feel when I hold this blade is something that is very, I don't know, really well thought out. Now, I've been a little bitch as it relates to all the imperfections and aesthetic compromise things that I notice on it. But in terms of how it feels dynamically, I feel very connected to the tip of the blade. It feels very controllable. It feels like it has mass. It's not a small blade. This is 2 pounds 6 ounces, which would be a, you know, I'm more of a Japanese sword guy, so as I relate it to a katana, 2 pounds 6 ounces is kind of in the middle range, or the middle lightweight of a two-handed sword. So given that this is, you know, a one-handed, you know, kind of smaller sword than a katana is, 2 pounds 6 ounces is not a small weight for a blade. I am not an expert on Messer, so I do not know where that falls in the average for a blade of its size. But given that it's got a really stout, wide blade, it's reasonably thick here at the base, I'd have to imagine that that it is, perhaps on the heavier side, or at least, well within the average weight, because it's not light. But it's not light, but it feels very controllable. So as I try to generate tip speed to fling the tip out here, I still have no problem controlling it. I'm not hitting my computer monitors, and it's easy for me to get the blade moving, to stop it, to control where this point goes. I feel very surprised at how connected to my hand this feels. It feels like a custom sword really should, in that when I move it around, I don't, I can pick it up and tell somebody thought about how dynamically this is supposed to feel. And I, given that, again, I've shared with you my history with historic European martial arts and not being a student of them, I still love swords. I love all different kinds of swords, and I can tell when one feels good in the hand, and this certainly does. Now, how well does it perform? Well, at this point, I haven't done a ton of cutting with it. What I have done is drunkenly cut a little bit of paper, and what I can tell you from that experience is that it moves through paper reasonably well. The secondary bevel on it doesn't really seem to impede much. In terms of other cutting, well, take a look. The first thing I'm going to cut is going to be a pool noodle. Now, pool noodles are deceptively difficult targets because, well, they require edge alignment and a sharp edge, but more edge alignment than anything else. If you don't have edge alignment, then they kind of flop around like a limp dick in front of your face, which is discerning and uneventful. Well, it's a little degrading. But nevertheless, they are actually a pretty responsive target to cut. They're not difficult, they're not really hard to cut, as much as they're very pliable, so they absorb a lot of shock if you don't do it right, of which I am not doing a lot of things right in this particular cutting thing. However, when the edge alignment is good, the blade kind of clips right through. Now, that's more for me to get a feel of the blade than really to show you its aptitude. But if you garner anything from watching me cut a pool noodle, there you go. The next thing that I cut is a bit of water bottles. Now, water bottles do quite a number of things in that they show you some edge alignment. In my case, cutting water bottles is a little different because it is about 20 below zero as I'm doing this cutting. So the blade might get cold. Ice chunks actually form along the edge, which is kind of a funny thing to see. And nevertheless, anyway, I'm cutting water bottles. The steam rising up, as you're seeing, is from the kind of lukewarm water meeting the 20 degree below zero weather. And it instantly makes an ice rink under my feet, which makes it not terribly fun to cut. Anyway, it zips right through water bottles. It's just a joy to cut with. And, I have to be very cognizant of when I'm cutting because my hands get really cold really quick. Now, I opt to do another round of cutting on another day. I got pretty cold doing the first round of cutting, and while it was eventful and showed me a lot about the sword, it wasn't enough to get a real good feeling. And I hesitated to cut tatami because as I wet tatami and bring it outside, it almost instantly turns into an ice cube, and it's not really a fair comparison testing wet tatami at 20 below versus wet tatami in room temperature or above, right? So bear in mind that this tatami is turning into a popsicle rapidly. Now, I've tried to make it as room temperature as I can, but 20 below freezes things pretty quick, and the surface of this tatami has turned into a little bit of a popsicle. So it still moves through the tatami extremely well. Now, also notice that I'm not putting a lot of effort into the cuts. At least the first couple cuts, I'm moving through very gently, and I'm trying to control the blade, which shows just how nimble this blade actually is. Dynamically, it's very easy to move, and it does a lot of the work for you. It wants to cut, it wants to move into that chopping motion, and it's very easy to basically have a successful cut and be able to pay attention to edge alignment and rely on the sword to do some of the work. In the thrust, it does also a really good job. It sails honestly right through tatami like it's not even there. It's hard for me to do it because at this point I've cut a few water bottles and it's an ice skating rink underneath me, but nevertheless, cutting tatami was pretty fun. It was only when I had bad angles that it really gave me any trouble. The next thing I opted to do is cut a cloth target. Now, I basically stuffed an old shirt full of other old rags and stuff that I'm planning on tossing away, and it really cut very easily. Now, this is a little tricky. You wouldn't think that a dress shirt would be that hard to cut, and frankly, it's not, but they tend to wrap around the blade, especially when it's kind of limp, dry cloth, not substantiated or backed by a human torso. There's not much there that gives it a backing, and I've only attached it to basically an old Yari pole that I broke some time ago that isn't stuck very firmly in the base that I have it on, and it still cut pretty deeply into the shirt. I'm actually really impressed. This goes to show how sharp the edge is, because if you don't have a really sharp edge, well, it doesn't cut into the cloth at all, but if you do, it really moves into the cloth quite well, and I found that to be the case here. Whether I'm cutting kind of the limp arms in the cloth or not, it cuts right into it. Now, unfortunately, my slow-mo camera was, well, it ran out of batteries because it's 20 below, and my iPhone was not terribly responsive to it when I actually brought it outside. So I don't have slow-mo footage. Also, I then opted to cut a few more water bottles just because I love ice skating, and there we go. So what do I think of the actual cutting? I think it did a spectacular job cutting. It was a joy to move around. I mean, obviously, the joy was tempered by the fact that it was really, really cold outside, but I found it to be a very comfortable blade to move around, even though it's an unfamiliar style to me, even though it's mounted like a big knife handle. I thought it was just really fun to move around. I thought the tip was really controllable, and as I was cutting the tatami, it really kind of sang more than anything else. Two things really impressed me about this cutting. One, the tatami, and I just kind of let the sword fall, and it moves through the tatami, and the tatami is turning into a popsicle, and it wasn't soaked for more than about 5 hours. So I really give some credit to this blade's cutting ability. And two, the cloth. Now, I don't usually cut this on camera because I don't usually throw away my clothes. I wear them because I'm a man since the time I was 15 until, well, basically they degrade into nothing, or my wife tells me I have to throw them away. And that's what happened here. But when I have cut cloth, denim, shirts, sheets, rags, whatever, oftentimes they bind up in the blade. The blade doesn't bite into the cloth quick enough, and I really make very little progress in cutting even pretty thin t-shirt type stuff. It's not unless it's backed by something substantial that I make any progress. So this was actually a bit of a surprise and a testament to how sharp the edge is. So do I think it's worth it? Well, before I can answer that, you have to know how much it costs. And, well, you know, I could have sworn that Tom was asking more than $1,000 for this when he first started out. Irregardless, I asked him, and he said it'd be about $950 if you wanted one of these now. Or at least that would be where the starting price would be, depending on what other adornments and bedazzlements you might like. But by having a custom smith, you can pick the type of guard and the type of geometry, and it doesn't have to necessarily be this one. It can be something different. Nevertheless, $950 is where it is, and for $950, is it worth it? Well, honestly, I mean, from one side, yes, and from one side, no. And let me elaborate. So if you are looking for something performance characteristically that you get this complicated geometry, you know, the Elmslie Type 3E, and you've basically got a lot happening here. You've got a lot of distal tapering. There's a lot of geometry for something that might just kind of look cool. There's a lot of dicking around that has to happen to make this feel the way it does. You also have a pretty complex hilt assembly and some inlays and all sorts of neat stuff going on. So for $950, the way this handles, the way it feels, and what you're getting, yeah, I think that's a great value. The thing is, it's not going to necessarily appeal to somebody that is going to have OCD about some of these finer characteristics. I mean, the kind of unevenness of the inlay, the fact that I can see, you know, kind of the ends and the glue behind the scales, some of the details and just the roughness around the edges that maybe some people will really like and find as a feature. Others may find that it kind of lacks the refinement that you'd expect in a blade that is, you know, supposed to be a custom-made piece. Now, I don't think that that's necessarily fair. This is stylistically what Tom made. It's a perfectly functional piece. But if you're looking for very refined, very elegant, all finished lines, attention to those very small cosmetic details, this isn't going to necessarily be the thing for you, and it's missing the mark there. Now, what I can show you is something from, say, Albion. Now, if I look at Albion's offerings, what I have here is the Vassal. That's a falchion, so a little different. But here we have a soldat. It looks like it has a knuckle guard on it, or a nail as well. Similar hilt construction, a little bit different, you know, in terms of in terms of the handle. It's centered versus offset. But you can see just some of the finishing lines and how the scales fit on, and a lot of the just refinement that you come to expect when you get an Albion piece. So it's a little different. There's also another piece coming, the Meister, I'm probably saying it wrong, but $1,400, and this Soldat is probably the closest thing at $1,221. Really, I mean, that's a couple $100 more for something that is realistically not as complicated. The geometry, the little things and attention to detail, like where I can put my thumb, the decorations, the inlay, and overall this kind of more complicated geometry. You get more features here than you do on the Albion piece, but you have a higher cost and a higher level of finishing detail on the Albion piece. So it seems like there are other options out there. There's also other custom smiths, but the thing is, I think if you want that kind of level of detail, you can probably ask Tom if he can pull it off, but it's just going to cost more money because it takes more time to do. So for what I'm holding here, for $950, this seems like a really good value, because I understand that it is complicated to make this type of sword. There's a lot of work that went into this, and for the price that you pay and what you get, I think this is a fantastic deal. But I will say that the level of the kind of unfinished goofiness that I see is going to drive some people nuts. There's a lot of common things that people complain about in lower end swords: the unevenness, the lack of symmetry, the little details that just aren't finished are going to drive some people crazy. And if you're one of those people, then this probably is not the one for you. But performance and dynamic and all the other things wise, other than those small aesthetic details, I think it really nails it, hits it out of the park. Dynamically, it feels great. It moves well. It cuts well. I'm really happy with it. So I think Tom did a hell of a job. And if you're interested, then you can talk to him about it. Well, speaking of talking to Tom, maybe we should do that. This is Tom Kinder. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Tom Kinder, a swordsmith with TomKin Forge, which I don't know. It's what I do. I'm a full-time I'm a full-time bladesmith, and I've been making swords full-time for almost 2 years now, and I've got several years of off and on blacksmithing and bladesmithing experience from before that, and really, I guess we're just here to talk about one of my swords and how things work, and I don't know. Let's have some fun.
That's a good enough intro right there. I'm Tom Kinder. I'm with TomKin Forge. I'm the only guy that works there.
Right. That's it. I'm the only guy that works. So that's
it. Makes me feel better to say I'm with somebody. I'm with me. Yeah. I'm in good company. I talk to myself a lot. I do the same thing.
Hey, someone's got to talk to me, man. Someone's got to talk to me.
All right. So we're here to talk about this Messer, this piece that Tom made about a year and a half ago.
About that, yeah. It was finished. I think it was actually finished around October of 2016. So I guess not quite a year and a half ago. Okay. But I didn't. No, I think October is about when I started trying to sell it. It was done for a couple months before I started selling it.
Well, so, you got to take some time to appreciate.
So, it took me a while to decide that I was actually going to sell it. Actually.
Well, that's fair. I do the same thing with a lot of the swords I get. It takes me a little bit to figure out what I'm going to do with them. But yeah. This one, so to jump the gun a little bit for the sake of time, you decided to make this on a whim. This wasn't a commission. This was something that you did as a project because you wanted to.
Correct.
What made you want to make a Messer like this? This is a complicated project.
I really enjoy the fighting styles that are used with Messers, and theoretically falchions, even though none of the historical effect books actually talk about falchions. They talk about Messers, but the fighting styles that are used in the historical treatises on Messers I find very fun and enjoyable. Through my experience with Messers and falchions, I have found that I really like the blade style. They're fun to cut with. They feel good to me. I basically just really enjoy them. And so, I wanted to make one sooner or later. It was one of those bucket list things. Hey, I'm going to do this, And one day I was struggling with a project, and sometimes you got to change gears and get out of your rut, and I needed to do that. And I said, it's time to make a messer.
Now, this isn't necessarily comic relief, and maybe the rest of the review that's shown. This is an extremely complicated product. I mean, at a glance, it might look simple. It might look like a grandiose kitchen knife, but the distal taper, the geometry, the edges, how everything aligns, and to do this and make it feel the way it does is not a simple task. So frankly, I can't imagine what project was giving you trouble if you chose life on hard mode as relief. I mean,
well, it was more about variety and breaking the cycle I was in than it was about doing something easy.
Okay.
And another thing is, I really enjoy learning stuff when I'm in the forge and challenging myself and picking up new things. And if I recall correctly, the project I was working on was something that felt kind of stale to me, and I just wasn't into it. And that was probably the reason I was having trouble with it, is because I'm kind of ADHD. I flit from one thing to another, and if I'm not feeling the love on a project, I sometimes put it down until I do, because I'm not doing my best work if I don't feel the love on it.
That's fair.
So, that's kind of a glimpse into the craziness that's all up in here.
I think that's probably an important thing. I mean, as I look at the people that, the artists and craftsmen that decide to take on bladesmithing, it's a labor of love. There's you really have to, because it seems like, just like,
that's totally what it is for me. I mean,
it seems like you have the same luck as rock stars. Like less than 1% are really going to make it and make it big, and the rest of people are keep jamming out because they like music. Because they love doing it, because probably more or less they have to do it, not because it's a
right.
It's a financially fiduciary responsibility type thing.
I guess it was about 4 years ago that I made my first sword. And I was convinced at the time that I did not have the equipment that I needed to be able to make a sword of any kind. But my boys wanted to do it over a weekend. We tackled it and we made it happen. And it was kind of an awful sword. But once I realized that I was capable of making a sword, I suddenly was incapable of not making swords. I had to do it. I mean, I've always loved swords. I've fought with them for years. I've studied them for years. I've studied the history around them. I've studied, what they look like and stuff like that. And so when I finally realized that I could make swords, that's what I had to do.
I understand that. So with this sword in particular, I'm getting why that makes a little bit more sense. You weren't super engaged in the project you were doing, and you needed something that got the juices stirring. What were you going for when you made this?
Okay, there's a falchion / storta, which is the Italian word that they use for falchions, means crooked. There's an antique that's held in the New York Metropolitan Museum that has the double clip like you see on there, and has a blade profile.
This bit?
Yeah, correct. A blade profile somewhat similar. Mine's a little different around the base, because mine's got a wider base, and the recurve is different than what theirs has. But I absolutely love the shape and the look of that antique, and it's been one of those things that's just tickled at the back of my mind for a long time, and I wanted to make one. And so as soon as I decided I was going to make a messer, I knew what path I was going down. I knew I was going down the Elmslie 3E, path with a double clip and a point on the center, and I knew I was going there because that was my favorite one. The hilt was a lot more foggy. It was one of those pull it together as you get to it kind of things. I did the blade, I did the handle. You talked a little bit in a post earlier today about the handle being offset instead of center.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, at the time, that was a bit of a brain fart on my point, because I had not at that point seen an antique messer with a handle that's offset like that. I since have, but not out there,
Yeah.
and you know,
And so
it,
that post you're talking about earlier, for folks that aren't aware of it, I asked the community more at large, what does this dynamically do? Like aesthetically, it looks like a kitchen knife. It's not unfamiliar, but on a sword, it seems a little odd to not have the grip in the center and to have it, kind of follow along the spine of the blade. And so
well,
the question is more or less dynamically, what does that do?
right, and well, a messer's a knife. That's the one thing that was going through my head actually when I was making it. I was thinking of the history behind it, where the German knife guild guys were wanting to make swords because they were popular and they sold well and people wanted them, but they had to make it a knife because they weren't part of the sword makers guild. And you make a sword, if you're not a sword maker, you're in trouble, buddy. So they made a knife. And I really believe that they made sure that you knew it was a knife by naming it knife. It's not a sword, it's a knife. That's messer. Messer means knife. That's a knife, right? So I was thinking about that, and I thought about kitchen knives and some of the knives I've seen and stuff, and I hammered the handle in, and I lined it up at the point, and I got it where I liked the way it looked, and I thought, ooh, that'll feel good in hand. Okay, that's a knife. That's a knife handle. And a couple hours later, when I went inside and started looking at pictures, I was like, wait a minute. Well, this thing is not like the others, because it was offset. That's not a bad thing. I went back and I played with a lot, and dynamically, now we're going to get around to answer that question. Dynamically, what it does is it changes where the weight sits in your hand. If you hold a blade directly in the center, the weight is kind of evenly distributed front to back, especially if it's a symmetrical sword, which this obviously is not. So you definitely wouldn't want an off-center handle on a symmetrical sword. But as a Messer's asymmetrical sword, and it's a knife, really, I felt that a knife handle wasn't out of place. And so with the handle being back towards the back of the spine, obviously the weight's going to sit a little bit more forward in front of your hand, and it's going to change the point at which, when you kind of do this with the sword, it's going to change where you feel the rotation point a little bit. I don't think that it's a major change. I think it's a fairly minor change in the rotation points. But if you're paying attention, I think you'll pick up on it.
Yeah, granted, I tend to swing the sword like a club, and I'm working on that. But for me, when I hold the sword, it definitely kind of wants to lean forward a little bit rather than kind of balance upright. It always wants to kind of start chopping. And I noticed that my knuckles are in line with the edge, and it gives me a sense it feels a lot more nimble than a sword, this fat and stout and big has any right to. I really feel like I can, kind of pick things out of your teeth without cutting you.
Well, that's the idea. I mean, a Messer, every historical source I've seen on a Messer has shown people dueling. Okay? Were they used in war? Okay, yeah, I'm sure they were. I suppose we have like the Massachusetts Bible and some of the older stuff where they're technically falchions and choppers, they call them, but those swords are pretty significantly different than that one that you've got there. Those swords, in my mind, are pretty different. Every time I see a sword that looks like that one, in historical context, I have seen it in a dueling scenario. So to me, that says that sword wants to be nimble. You want to have control of it. And even more important, I think, than being fast is when you reach out with your arm with the sword in it, you need to be able to feel where the edge is, feel where the point is, so that you know where your offensive bits are, so that you know when you feel that you've slipped past the point of no return where your opponent can't guard, you know how to get it to the soft and squishy bits that you're looking for. You know, the feeling is very, very important to me. I'm very, very tactile. I'm very into the motion and the feel of swords. And so to me, that's the most important thing.
And I think that shows, because when as I hold this with my eyes closed, I wouldn't think that it is what it is, right? If I held this in my hand, I would have guessed that it's a much shorter blade, about yay tall, but you have this long blade on it. But with my eyes closed, it feels so nimble that it must be just a big Bowie knife or something. And instead, it's this pretty grandiose, substantial blade, and it feels very nimble, very controllable, and dynamically it moves. Having cut with it a little bit, it moves through targets. It's easy for me to have edge alignment, even with a sword I'm not unfamiliar, that I'm unfamiliar with, and I'm cutting, while simultaneously trying to skate. I was cutting water bottles, and it's 24 below outside, so the water just freezes on my patio, and so it's a little bit of slip and slide. But I actually got pretty close to, putting the target where I wanted to, even though I'm ice skating. So, this is extremely controllable and very nimble, and I definitely get the sense that you thought about it and dicked around with it until it felt the way it was supposed to. And that much is definitely coming through. But that, I suppose, is a good time to maybe talk about some of the things that I was not so kind about, or as I described in the review, that I'm being
you're fair about it.
I appreciate that, but I was a little bitchy.
Okay. No, dude, trust me. You know what finally made me want to sell that sword is I wanted it out of my sight. I'll be honest. I'm not as picky about the details by visually as I am about tactilely, but at the time I made that, I had done very few full tang knife handles. Okay,
and by that you mean these scales, right?
Right, scales. I had done 0 knives that had steel bolsters or end caps on them. So that was the very first time I was ever getting a wood scale to fit up to a steel thing up front and a steel thing up back. And that makes a big difference, because the fitting requirement on that is a lot more strict and precise than if you're putting wood to wood. Because you put wood to wood, you just glue them together, let the glue set, and then you put it together and carve it to where you want. But when you got to put all those several pieces together and get them to fit this way and this way and this way, the precision you have to attain to get that fit correct is a large step above anything that I had done up to that point. So that was the first handle like that I had actually made. And yeah, it shows. It's fair to say that it shows.
What about the inlay? So the inlay work, and I've heard, I've taken some tours of Arms and Armor, and I've talked to those folks, and they run the Oakshott Institute, and they've kind of embedded in my mind that the medieval European idea of symmetry is a little bit different, and so things aren't always perfectly symmetrical, and that wasn't odd from a historical context. But this inlay does strike me as a little less than unsymmetrical. Would you say that this is one of your first attempts, or have you gotten better at it? Or
that was about my third piece of work that I did with any sort of inlay. If you look at my maker's mark, the TK on the blade, that's the only inlay I had done before this sword. That mark, that TK, is the only thing I had inlaid on anything up until this point, and I had done it on 2 small knives. So that was the third thing I did with a finished project with an inlay on it in copper. And I wanted to, again, it was a piece where I was challenging myself and learning things. So I decided I wanted to go with a cross potent, which is what that cross design is called. There are historical examples that are sloppy. I don't really want to say that there are ones that are like that, because I can't really back that up.
Well, sloppy, I think, just to cut you off, and I'm sorry, because that's a dick move from an interview standpoint, but I
Oh,
would, I'd pull back and say you owe yourself a little bit more credit. The lines are wiggly, right? So
yeah.
sloppy, I've seen sloppy inlays, and that's when the bit that you're inlaying is poking out or falling out, or when I
Uh,
move my hands, that it bites into my hands and it pokes me and doesn't, dynamically, this is
I would call
fine.
that a failed inlay.
Yeah, I mean, it's a, the lines themselves move around, and I mean, if I was being crass, I'd say you draw it on with crayon, but the,
Well, no,
the
I drew it on with a magic marker. And,
grown-up
and
crayon.
then I used a razor blade to kind of clean up the edges of the line.
Yeah,
I took
but
a
it's
chisel.
still in there. Like it's got some gaps and the lines wiggle, but it's still in there. It hasn't fallen
Well,
out, and it doesn't
oh,
bite me.
it won't fall out. It will not, because I'll tell you why. The process you do to make that, I took a little chisel about this long that I made and held it in my hand and with a hammer, and I followed those lines, going tick, 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 gouging out a channel along the lines that I drew on the pommel, right? Then I took another chisel, a small chisel about the same size, with a teeny little head on it, and you get it, like if this is your channel, like this is the pommel's here, and you put it here, so that the channel's this way, right? If you're looking down the trench, you put that chisel in at an angle down into the trench, so you dovetail the trench. So the trench is wider in the bottom than it is on the top. And then you hammer the copper into it, and of course it swells out and the bottom locks in. It'll never come out unless you get in there with a tool and dig it out.
Yeah, that's fair, and so that's why I'd say it's the fact that, well, I might think the lines move. It's sloppy, I suppose, is maybe an appropriate word for the meandering, but I think that has a connotation of work that is not functional, and this is functional. It's not pristine, but it's functional.
Perfectly honest, what you're seeing is a lack of refinement due to lack of experience. Like I said, it's like the third thing I did. So I have this chisel in my hand, I'm tapping with a hammer, and I'm trying to keep it straight and lined up, and it wanders a bit. Maybe my chisel got dull and I didn't sharpen it soon enough, and if your chisel gets dull, you tend to slip and stuff. I don't remember exactly what happened, but I can tell you, in all fairness, that was it was a new project for me. It was a new design, something I'd never done before, and
Yeah.
it was still something that was pretty new to me. So honestly, it's totally fair to say that there's a lack of refinement to it, because that's exactly what it is.
Well, that's fair. And for those that might not be super familiar, doing a copper inlay is, I'm used to seeing inlays as it relates to Japanese fittings, and you can see some of the more masterful approaches to copper inlays in some of the videos for people that make those fittings. But the amount of trial and error and the amount of skill and time and energy and, well, I guess the tuition paid to be able to make them refined is pretty substantial. So it's not the fact that it's in there and functional is pretty good. It's one of your first go-arounds.
I'm a fan of Japanese swords too, and I think I've seen some of the inlays that you've seen. I would guess that the guy that made most of those inlays probably was doing inlays for many years before before any of his inlays saw the light of day.
And I think that's a fair note. So we've talked about the inlay and we've talked about the scales. The next bit is this guard here, and now one thing I notice is that the squares are a little crooked. It's not perfectly symmetrical. I see grind lines. Can you tell me a little bit about the pain in the ass that went around this guard? Because I can see that this guard gave you a few ass pains.
Oh, yeah. The first thing is, just getting it all lined up. Of course, the shape itself is rather complicated, with all the different planes and geometries in it. But more than that, the shape also has to line up with the sword, and you have to punch and or drill and or carve a hole and a slot through this way, and actually a very wide slot for this type of a handle. Again, having not made that type of a handle up to that point, I was accustomed to sword tangs, which are pretty narrow, really, by comparison. So the hole that I had to make through there was a lot longer from side to side than I'd done previously. Yeah, from edge to spine, on both ends, but not on the blade end so much, but on the hilt end, it was wider, and obviously it's not the same. And of course, you have the nagle there, the little guard that comes off the side, and that complicates things too because it has to go through perpendicularly, from the flat, and then it all has to fit together. And I set this all up before heat treat because I don't know you, but I did not want to try to drill all those holes through that blade after it was hardened. That's a recipe for disaster. It's more work than it's necessary. It's ridiculous. So heat treat, however, and this is something you don't think about unless you're a bladesmith probably, is when you treat it, the blade's going to get covered in scale. And you got to go back, you got to grind all that off again. So once again, you're losing material, and you got to plan on that loss of material happening. So you fit something up, and you get it to fit just right, and then you lose the material. It doesn't fit just right anymore. So you gotta fit that up and make it too tight so it doesn't fit by just enough, so that when you lose that material after heat treat, it fits. And that's it's like throwing a dart at a moving target on the other side of the room. It takes some practice, and so are there better and easier ways? Are there tricks? Sure, there are tricks, and some things that help you get it better. And I'm learning those, and I'm getting better at them. But it is what it is.
Is this a freehand grind? And I'm
absolutely.
Okay.
I know any jigs.
And so I think that's maybe something that's worth noting for folks. So in my review, I haven't done the best job. I rewatched what I had said, and it's a lot of mouth word vomit. So these swells, these little gentle tapers here, all have to be done by eye and by hand to make it symmetrical. The little end to make them square has to be done kind of all by eye, all by hand. On a it's a pain in the ass. So even though this looks like a simple bar, grinding this out and making it even and symmetrical is a tricky thing to do.
Absolutely. And I mean, I don't even have a tool rest on my grinder. It's when you say freehand, it is freehand. It's not sitting on a table against the grinder, against the wheel, against the belt. It's open air in my hand on the machine, and that's it.
Yeah, that's and I honestly, knowing a little bit about how you made it, at least to me as the owner, it gives it a sense of charm, and rather than just seeing all of the issues that are harder to excuse when you have jigs and tools, and you make it, or it's built off of you made a mold and you just kind of fucked up the wax or something like that. Knowing that it's kind of ground freehand gives it oddly a sense of charm that it's weird. Maybe it's this hearty stout that I'm drinking, but it kind of makes me like it a little bit more. So,
good.
Yeah, that's.
I think there's a lot to do with that. Is modern understanding of manufacturing processes. I mean, even though I do use modern equipment like electric grinding machines and forge presses and things like that now, it's actually, the process is quite a bit different than what you see in modern manufacturing. Modern manufacturing, you've got sockets, you've got little apparatuses that hold the thing you're working on. With set bars, you only go so far forward, so you get the same shape repeatedly every time, because in the modern world, our manufacturing is very precise. That's what we do, and that's what it has to be to meet our standards. The sort of process I'm going through is very different, and honestly, when you get people like Michael Tinker Pierce who can grind a fuller by hand in the air, free on a grinder, that impresses me more than anything else that people do. And you have people like the guys at Arms and Armor, you know, Craig Johnson. Um, the swords that he makes with a giant angle grinder. You know, how most of the work is actually done. And you look at the precision, you look at the beautiful lines, and you know, you realize that there's this guy standing there holding a 16-pound angle grinder because he doesn't use one of the little ones, he uses one of the big ones, and that's how he made that sword. And, you know, I mean, of course, both these gentlemen, Tinker and Mr. Johnson, have been doing this for a decade or two, so they've got a lot of great experience. And that's where people like me hope to be going, and that's where people like me hope to be in a decade.
There's some examples of arms and armor on my back wall over here, as well as a piece from Tinker, there's differences, and it's not honestly fair for me to compare this blade to some of the more simple or more complicated designs I have, but
oh yeah, I wasn't meaning that.
No,
the point though is that it's a difficult process, and the few people that are out there who can do it by hand, freehand, and make it look beautiful are really impressive people, and their work should be appreciated. One of these days I'm going to be one of those people that does it freehand and it comes out pristine. I'm not that person today, but I'm on my way.
Well, that's a fair and admirable way to look at it. Now, as actually I compare this work to others. Now, if I look at the, and I don't know how well this is going to come out here, but as I look at the flats of the blade, this is a very wide. There's a lot to work with here, and to make this flat, I acknowledge, is probably a little more difficult than if you had, a little smaller work area, so to speak. And it's actually not for most European swords that I've seen. This isn't too bad in terms of the wiggle, but honestly, a lot of people don't seem to care about that factor when it relates to European style swords. So, in Japanese swords, like how flat the planes are is kind of a big deal, but I haven't heard anyone really make a big fuss about it. The Albions I've seen wiggle around, the Tinker and the arms and armor piece I've seen wiggled around. There's very few European swords. The only custom piece that I can think of is, I'm going to massacre his name, Daniel Digardella, the Mad Dwarf or Cedar Lord Forge.
I don't know, yeah.
Yep, so
I think is how he pronounced it. But anyway, what you're seeing,
is your grinding.
What you're seeing there is an artifact from a belt sander, basically. They got the big machines. They got an abrasive belt on them. It moves real fast. You put it on a flat platen, or you work it underneath a contact wheel, and there are things you can do to get the surfaces flatter and better on a machine like that, but you are limited to how flat it can get by the quality of the seam on the belt. The way the belt butts together will actually make a lot of what you're seeing there. And honestly, if you work it by hand under the wheel, you're going to see a lot more of that than if you work it on the flat platen. But even on the flat platen, you're going to see some of that. You can get rid of that. I can get rid of that. I've got a steel block in on one of my benches in the shop that's been machined perfectly flat on top, and I keep it oiled so that it's nice and flat. But to make a surface that is completely, perfectly flat like that is many, many, many hours of work. And I will do it, but it's going to cost people.
That's fair.
Generally, I figure that the added cost does not justify the lack of a little bit of wiggle.
What do you mean, Tom? When I hold the blade up like this, I can see it, and other than that, I never ever notice it. I mean, don't you always just look at your sword like this? Isn't that how you... No, I'm just messing with you.
Well, I spend a lot of time looking at swords like that.
Well, that's fair. And speaking of as swords like this, one thing I do notice as well, and we talked about the recurve, and I think you saw it from the review stuff, but the edge wiggles a little bit. And I think if I were to criticize anything in the sword, that is the one that throws me off the most, is that there seems to be this meandering edge. And I was wondering if you can address that part.
Absolutely. And in all honesty, that's just a sign of inexperience on a grinder. Again, it was my first. I was in my first year as a professional bladesmith, and as you notice, it's a fairly large blade. It's a fairly long blade. There's a lot of complex geometry going on there. It's and when it's subtle geometry on the blade because it looks like this big wide flat thing, but there's really a lot more going on there than just being wide and flat. The threshold of a customer may be different than my threshold as a maker. I'm always going to try to strive to do better and to satisfy them. But some people like yourself look down a blade and they see every little detail. Some people pick it up, say, "That's really cool. I like that," and they never see any of that stuff. So it's a wide world of variety out there in customers as well as art and pieces, and you've got to roll with the punches. You've got to talk, you got to communicate, and you got to figure out what works for everyone. And some people are not going to be compatible. Some people are not going to be compatible with my work. Some people will never ever enjoy my work. As much as I would love everyone in the world to say, "Wow, TomKin swords are the best ever," that's not going to happen. And so, you treat it like a girlfriend. You figure out that the relationship's not working. You do your best to split on good terms. You do what you can to make everyone whole at the end, so you don't walk away with hurt feelings, and you move on with your life. And for those people who want really super pristine, super clean work, I may not be their best choice right now.
Yes. You see, I'm on a. This is my daughter, Faith.
Hello, Faith.
I don't think she can hear you but that's okay.
Oh, okay.
What's going on?
I was just wondering if I can go on the computer.
If you can be like super quiet and not press any buttons.
How can I not press any buttons on the computer?
Well, then how about in like 30 minutes? Because you're you see.
I'll just try to be as quiet as I can.
Yeah. You're gonna make a great salesman one day. All right, shut the door and be really quiet, okay?
Okay, so where were we? Yeah. Okay, so like I was saying,
you were giving me, I think, the longest answer to yes, my grind lines are better, or no, they are not.
my grind lines are definitely better today than they were when that sword was made. Whether or not my grind lines and attention to detail are going to be up to a person's standard is something that they're going to have to decide ultimately. You can talk, well, is it as clean as that or as clean as that? And maybe yes, maybe no. But ultimately, people are just going to have to decide whether or not it's for them. And I'm just going to keep on working and keep on improving.
Like the video is doing the best job of showing. It's a very subtle wiggle. I mean, it's not as though there's giant swoops or it looks like a serrated edge or something. But there is a bit of a difference as it relates to, as I look at every other custom sword. I mean, in fairness, as I look at the Tinker sword that I have, right, the flats of the blade wiggle and wobble around quite a bit, and that was one thing that kind of surprised me. And there's some variance as I look at custom makers, but pretty uniformly, everyone has a profile that seems consistent. I mean, there might be a curve, but there's a, I don't know, you know what I'm talking about, hopefully, where it looks very intentional.
Profile.
Well, the line on the edge is consistent, and it looks like you took a string and stretched it or bent it, but it doesn't wiggle around. And so I get what you're saying from the standpoint of it being a, you're kind of figuring it out, right? You made this sword as you were about a year into being a professional swordsmith, and you've acknowledged that you're getting better at the grinder, and that's what it takes. So the main question is, if I were a prospective buyer, and I looked at this as an example of one of the pieces that you have out there that's on the internet, would I expect this level of cleanliness on the lines, or would it be better?
I think you would expect better. I think that's when we're talking about cleanliness, I would say that is probably the least clean sword I have ever let out of my shop.
Well, I'm still happy to own it, Tom. So I think that's. I'm asking that question more from the standpoint of, as I look at the aesthetic pieces, in the likelihood, I mean, Messers are not an overwhelmingly popular type of sword, but they're an interesting bit out there. And, you know, the people make them, but you make a lot of other types of products as well, a lot of other types of swords, and as a result, the finish work and stuff like that, people can get an idea of the capability. And I'll show some of the photos of your other works as well, so that people have a more rounded idea if they were to commission you to do a piece for them, you know, kind of what to expect. And if this is one of the roughest, if this is as bad as it gets, then, I mean, that's still pretty good. The main thing would be that the edge. A lot of people get kind of sensitive about that, myself included. And if this is as bad as it can get, then, well, I think that's...
I feel that it is.
I know you're a modest guy, so, you know, you can...
Well, we talked earlier, and I mentioned that that sword was actually done a month to 2 months before I ever decided to sell it. And the cleanliness issue, in fact, was exactly the reason why I was hesitant to sell it. You know, when I was done with it at first, my first impression was, well, I guess I own another sword. Because, you know, when I make a sword that I don't feel is clean enough to be, you know, put on the market, but it's not bad enough that I need to destroy it, because, you know, if it handles right, it moves right, you know, it is a sword, then, well, I'll just put it on my personal sword rack and hang on to it. I have two of those, almost three. That would have been third. I have two of those, swords like.
Well, you know, I'm glad you let it out there, because frankly, I mean, despite its, you know, despite the cosmetic issues, using wise, I at first, you know, the video that you got to see was some water bottle cutting and whatnot, but having now gone through and chopped it to Tommy mat that was all but frozen in my lovely 20-degree below zero weather, and moving through some other targets, the other thing that I got to do is my wife is throwing away all of my clothes that she doesn't like anymore, so so the New Year cleaning, if you will, and I filled up an old shirt with other old shirts, right? So it's loose fabric, and fabric is not something I typically film myself doing, but it's notoriously really difficult to cut, especially if it's dry and loose. It just kind of binds in the blade, and this thing kind of slapped right through like a dress shirt, and that's not something I've seen happen. So I mean, dynamically, it moves through stuff really well. So I'm glad you did sell it, because otherwise I probably wouldn't have had a chance to have this conversation. Anyway, I think that's, you know, I suppose, well, actually, there's one other question about the sword, and that is something I don't know a lot about, but I know metallurgically speaking, you're more of a know-it-all than I am. 80 CRV2, why was that the choice for this piece, and what do you think of that as a steel, having worked with it?
Okay. At the time that I made that sword, I was trying out several different steels, trying to decide what steel I was going to make my standard steel for swords. 80 CRV2 is a steel that's sold by the New Jersey steel baron, Aldo Bruno, and it's very popular among knife makers and sword makers for larger blades. It's very similar to a 1080 type of steel, except that it has vanadium added to it, which improves the wear resistance, improves edge retention, and also controls grain size during forging and heating, which will result in a tougher, stronger blade. It's a good steel. It's a really good steel, and I do like it a lot. It just turns out that I have since found a steel that I like better, and so I have not made 1080s or 80 CRV2 as my primary sword steel. I do like it, though. It's a very nice steel. It's got about 80 points of carbon, which puts it in a really good place for getting a good, hard, tough blade. Real easy, like it's easy to heat treat.
And what made you shift to whatever you're using now? What was the...
I found a cheap source of Crucible L6, which, chemically speaking, has a lot of advantages for me in the way my shop's set up. L6 it responds very well to the equipment I have, and honestly, it just it makes a harder wearing, tougher blade with my processes, in my opinion.
I think that's fair, and I'm sorry to jump out again at you. Again,
the big thing is the way, cause when you make swords, they always warp, they always bend. You always got to straighten them. And the process I use for straightening swords is a bit tricky. It involves a torch and water, and you have to be real careful not to overheat it. Okay, with 80 CRV2 and most other carbon steels that you find used in knives and swords, you got a very narrow temperature window that you can hit where it's hot enough to take the bends out, but yet not so hot as to damage the temper. With L6, I have a much larger window to work with. So I was going to say, with L6, I have a much larger temperature window to work with, and it actually just makes my job easier, which means that I turn out a better product. The steel itself is not really all that better than another steel. People like to talk and argue forever about what the best steel is, why this steel is better than that steel, and that steel is better than this steel. And here's the secret, guys. When you're talking about regular carbon steel, tool steel, within the range of steels that are common in swords, there's not much difference to the end user. The big difference is how the steel reacts to the processes and equipment that your smith uses. When your smith finds the steel that works best with his setup, that allows him to do his best work and to bring the best properties out of the steel. It's not that the steel is better, it's that it's a better fit for the smith, and therefore better work is done.
You're looking at it from the lens of a smith, and I think that's fair. I also tend to get a little, I don't know, I find the argument very old, and I remember being interested in it when I first came into the hobby of swords as to which steel was better, because you think about them initially as like the spec on a car, like horsepower, or like the speed of your computer, or the spec on any other modern machine. And while that can be true, if all things are equal, then there's probably some way to equate which one is better if everything else is equal. And you're talking about a person and a setup that can equally well manipulate all of these different types of steel. There's probably a good way of quantifying which one is better. But that is so far from reality, it doesn't exist.
Well, the chemical makeup of modern steels were all very thoroughly researched and very thoroughly designed by scientists and chemists and metallurgists working in concert with engineers, and they were designing these steels for specific uses, none of which was swords. Okay? So, yes, there are, like, 1086 is different than 5160, and 1086 is better for certain engineering applications than 5160. And when you get down to the machinery stressing stuff in the ways that engineers deal with in the modern world, there is a difference in quality between the steel types and grades. But you have to get down to the point where you are using machinery and scientific method to measure these things before you can really see the difference. When you're talking about a sword in a human hand, your human body is limited in how much stress and how much force you can put on that sword. And as I think you probably know, a sword made by Howard Clark out of 1086, which he does several of, is going to be a much better sword than an L6 sword made by Hanwei, even though L6 is reputed to be one of the best sword steels ever.
Didn't you just say you use it?
Too, But an L6 Hanwei katana is not going to be better than a 1086 Howard Clark katana because Howard Clark.
It's not. In fairness, there's a lot that goes into custom sword making from the buyer perspective, where you buy a reputation, and in a lot of cases, in the modern world, it doesn't necessarily. It doesn't mean what it used to mean, but it still does in the sense of swordsmithing. And when you buy a sword that's made by somebody who understands how to work with that steel and understands the metallurgy behind it and how to bring out the best characteristics of that steel, that blade gets individual attention. And if there's any issues, whether it be dynamically, how it feels, or in the heat treatment process, the thing that brings it out and being a sword, they're addressed. And in a mass production environment, that isn't always the case, and you end up with some issues. I some time ago did a review on a Hanwei L6 blade, and I whacked my stand, as I frequently do. With this blade, I whacked the peg underneath the tatami mat. I whacked the peg with the pool noodle, and I think in one of my backswings I whacked my grill. And there's no blemishes. There's no issues.
As I would expect.
But that Hanwei, I whacked a stand that I had whacked with many a sword beforehand, and it rolled the edge pretty substantially. So the heat treatment and be able to bring out those characteristics is important. And to your point, it's whether the smith can work with that steel and bring out the characteristics. That's a much more relevant variable, or a much more relevant point of importance than what steel you're getting.
Your smith is much more important of a thing for you to worry about selecting than the kind of steel. So many people, they make their whole choice on what they want for a sword based on the steel. Oh, I want this steel, I want that steel. Just, you should stop right there. You should never pick, as a customer, as a sword buyer, and I was one for a long time, you should never pick a sword based on steel. You should always pick your sword based on who's making it and how much you trust them to make a good quality sword. Because a good craftsman will make a better sword out of cheap 1060, 1055 sword than a crap craftsman will make out of the best steel you can possibly handle. And that's all there is to it.
And I can't say that the experiences that I've had would show anything different.
And it's like one of the biggest misconceptions in the sword market today.
That's fair. I mean, as I look at, and there's a price difference though. I mean, as you look from a buyer perspective, you see a Hanwei L6 blade on, from Cult of Athena or something for $1,000, and you look at a fully mounted Howard Clark blade when they come up for sale, or the journey it takes to get one finished, and you're talking about $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, $10,000 for a blade. I can't blame folks for saying, well, it's made out of the same stuff, and it's a nuanced thing to be able to appreciate that just because it says L6 doesn't mean that it's been heat treated to be a sword the same way. Anyway, that's steel nerdy stuff, and we can probably move on. Is there anything else that you think is worth noting about this one in particular, Tom?
Yeah, this sword, like I said, this was a learning experience for me. There are tons and tons of first times I did things on that sword. I have in my commission queue 2 Messers. So over the next year or two, I already have plans to make 2 more Messers. And when I do, they're going to be different than that one in several ways. I've learned some lessons about how to fit the guard to the blade, how to fit the nagle to the guard, how to fit the handles together. And so, it's a continuing process, right? Like one thing that I can tell you that I've abandoned entirely is if you look at that sword, you look at how the nagle goes into the guard on the other side. Yeah, that's the side. No, the other side. You had it right the first time. Probably hard to see on the video, but yeah, there you go. You can see where the socket didn't fit the guard real well. I had carved out a socket to accommodate the square base of the nagle. And I have since learned that, at least for me, that's the wrong way of doing it. I have seen some antiques since then, and I have seen some techniques that were used on them that's what I'm going to use to create the fit between the nagle and the guard in the future, and it's going to work out a lot better than that. That part of that sword will never be replicated. There will not be a pool of solder on a sword in the future. That was something I did to make it work, honestly, and it was a learning point for me. So that's a prototype sword, really, honestly.
Well, that's fair enough, and I think it shows. And I as a customer, as the guy that owns a sword, knowing that it's a learning experience, and honestly knowing a little bit more about how you made it, gives it a sense of charm that I don't think it had when it was, when in my mind I just think it's a finished object and a representation of what you put out there. But knowing that it's a first-time experience, or knowing, that you're freehanding this, or what your intentions were, is, I don't know, it adds to the experience, at least for me. And and I have to admit, it's pretty fun to whack stuff with. So
that's what it's for.
The other thing I guess I can ask is, for the folks that are interested in contacting you, where can they find you? Where can they reach out to you?
The best place to contact me is on Facebook. I have my phone on me all the time, and Facebook is always turned up to it. In fact, while we've had this interview, I've had I want to say about 10 messages come in over Facebook Instant Messenger. So when we're done here, I'm going to have to go see what those are. I think one of them looks like it might be a job. TomKin Forge is my business page on Facebook. You can look me up at TomKin Forge. You can look me up on my personal profile as Tom Kinder. I just look for the crazy distal taper guy, and that's the best way to contact me. If you do not like Facebook, you don't want to be on social media, you can use tomkinforge@gmail.com, and I read that email every day, and pretty good about responding to it.
Well, good. I'll put links to the things in the description below the video as well, and I'll also include some photos of other works that you've had that maybe address some of the handle construction or inlay or general lines and stuff like that show some other contrasting. You said that this is probably one of the rougher shaped pieces, so I can show some of the more bedazzled. Anyway.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
All right. Well, that's great. That's I guess all I have for you, Tom. Thanks much for your time, and hopefully, I don't know, good things.
Well, thanks for the review, the feedback. It's not real common that I have had such detailed feedback from a person with a discerning eye such as yours. A lot of people, they get a blade, they get excited about it, and they love it, or they hate it right away. But there's not a lot of detail, not a lot of really meaty bits to hang on to. And nothing you said surprised me. I knew it was all there, but it is good to know that people do see it, and what issues are important to people out there, because it helps me prioritize where I want to work on, what I want to improve on next, what I want to work on getting better. Lately, and I think I'm going to continue with this. Lately, I've been working on getting fit and finish dialed up to a better degree, and that's been one of my big focuses lately. And I think I'm going to continue with that, because as we can see, about a year and a half ago, it was a bit weaker than it is now.
And I mean, from the buyer, and I'm the first to acknowledge that I'm not an expert, right? I'm learning. I learn from a different perspective because I don't make them, but as I swing them around, but I'll admit I'm no master. So,
well, you don't have to have a discerning eye. You have to be an expert. You just have to care enough to take the time to look closely and to not shy away from the truth when you see it. And obviously you've done that, and I do appreciate that.
Well, I'm glad. If I could give you tips from what I prioritize, the thing that impresses me most that I don't see anywhere else, and that unfortunately through the mechanisms that I'm working with now with video are difficult to articulate, is the dynamic properties. And that's where I find most production pieces completely miss the mark. and yours hits it kind of nail on the head. So please don't lose that. Continue whatever you're doing to make things feel as good as they are. At least I notice that as a guy that doesn't deal with messers, but I can pick it up and say, ooh, somebody thought about this, and this feels the way it's supposed to. In terms of fit and finish as well, the other bit is there's probably a lot of people that will look at a thing that's more rugged or rougher and see a sense of charm in it. So I don't know that you can necessarily take my feedback. I mean, granted, I'm admitting I'm being a little bitchy. She can't hear me. I'm being particular about it, and I'm noticing flaws that are they're imperfections. But at the same time, there's going to be people that really kind of gravitate towards that kind of work, and so I don't necessarily think it's bad if you can offer both. I think that's maybe where your sweet spot is. But I hope it helps.
My personal goal is I want to present a finished product that is first and foremost a very high performance, weapon that will do what it is supposed to do as that weapon. That performance is absolutely my first priority. However, I do absolutely want it to be pleasing to look at. I want someone to be able to put my work up on the wall, show it to a friend, say, "Hey, look at this," and have them go, "Oh wow, that's nice looking. Look at this, look at that." And I don't want anyone to say, "Hey, look at this," but don't look too close because you got to feel it to appreciate it. I do want my stuff to be pretty. They don't have to win contests for their prettiness. They don't have to be the belle of the dance. But
no, that's fair. I mean, as I compare,
I do want them to be aesthetically pleasing as well as a high performance item.
And I think as I look at somebody that is working every piece by hand without templates, without the scale of mass production, you're still making a product. As I talked to you before, you said this one was $950 if somebody wanted one now.
So not now, yeah, no, yeah.
Yeah, if somebody wanted this one, and to have you commission to make another one, that it'd start at $950, and whatever other bedazzlements they'd like could be negotiated afterward. But the point is that that's still less expensive than higher end mass production pieces. And granted, there's a fit and finish difference, but you have something that's kind of genuinely handmade, and that's not. If that's a valuable thing to you, the fact that the handmade piece comes in under the price of a higher end mass production piece is pretty impressive. So value wise, I think you're you may have missed a few things aesthetically, but I think you compensate for that by also not charging $10,000 for it. So
right.
Anyway, that's
thank you very much. That's I definitely want to move into a place where my fit and finish is more competitive with the higher end markets. But the priority is always going to be performance, and if someone wants something that's a little bit rougher around the edges, I can do that too.
Fair enough.
I'm already good at that.
Yeah. All right, Tom. That's all I have for you. So I'll call it off here. Thanks very much for your time. And
all right, well, thanks very much. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about it and to address everyone, and just nerd out on swords, man. That's great. What's better than that?
All right, folks, me and Tom can nerd out on sword talk all day long, but that's really all I have for you. I hope you found this interesting, enjoyable, that you liked hearing from the manufacturer about the sword as it was reviewed. It's definitely a new format and a different opportunity, different challenge, different everything, but I hope it was helpful. I hope it was enjoyable. I hope it provided some information, especially if you were thinking about ordering a custom messer or sword in general from Tom. Anyway, that's all I have for you. As always, cheers and thanks for watching.